Two and a Half Admins, episode 175. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Twitch to shut down in Korea over prohibitively expensive network fees. This is a saga that has gone on for quite some time, and Alan, you have followed it.
Yeah, so South Korea did basically the opposite of net neutrality, and it's starting to take effect now. So Twitch CEO Dan Clancy said the firm has undertaken a significant effort to reduce the network costs of operating in Korea, including cutting the streams down to 720p and trying to use more peer-to-peer to avoid using as much bandwidth. But it still wasn't enough to make it profitable to operate in the country.
Because the bandwidth fees are just ridiculous for internet companies like Twitch.
Well, in particular, it's that South Korea does this kind of opposite thing where you as a customer pay an ISP to provide you with access to the internet. And that ISP then tries to also charge Netflix and Twitch and so on for that bandwidth a second time. So the internet generally works on a model of the uploader pays, right? So Netflix pays Netflix's ISP or transit provider to take the bytes from Netflix and deliver them to whoever wanted them. And the ISP is charging their end users a fee for access to the internet. And as part of that, is supposed to deliver the bytes the user asks for. And that's why your ISP often has a limit on how much you can download and so on, because that's how their pricing works. They shouldn't then also try to charge Netflix a second time. So Netflix has to pay their transit provider or ISP to upload the bytes, and then also has to pay the person who's downloading them? That doesn't make sense. But South Korea's ISPs had the ear of the government and are like, we think that, Netflix has built this $500 million business. We think they should have to support the ISPs to make sure they can provide enough bandwidth to let all the users download stuff. And it's really like, well, this ISP is selling to its customers access to the internet, and it wants somebody else to pay them again to actually go about providing that. It doesn't really make sense. The other part of the problem here, in addition to trying to charge Netflix for it, Netflix tries to avoid most of the cost of paying to upload stuff to the internet by offering ISPs like that a Netflix appliance that goes at the ISP and contains cached copies of most of the movies and TV shows so that doesn't use internet bandwidth. Now, Twitch can't quite do the same thing, but in general, Twitch is either using AWS or paying a CDN to deliver those bytes. So Twitch has already paid to upload that to the internet. And the customers of the Korean ISP have paid that ISP to be able to download it. And the ISP is like, well, we think Twitch should have to pay us too, which is trying to double dip on Twitch. And while I'm not saying that companies like Twitch and Netflix should get to abuse the internet for free, but the way the settlement model works for bandwidth on the internet has turned out to be the best way to do it most of the time. And I don't think ISPs trying to double dip really makes sense.
Today's anti-capitalist rant brought to you unexpectedly by Alan Jude, not Jim Salter, but I heartily co-sign it.
I'm not, it's definitely not anti-capitalist. As one of the CDNs, I just don't want to have to pay twice. I understand paying for bandwidth. I pay to upload it. I'm not paying someone else to let their customers download it. And mostly as the consumer of an ISP, I'm like, I'm paying you for this service. Why are you trying to charge the other person for it too? And then that means that I can't have Twitch anymore because you've decided to try to double dip. The telcos are the evil ones in this particular case.
I'm not an anti-capitalist. I just hate the inevitable outcome of capitalism, says noted Canadian. I mean, seriously, I'm not trying to get crazy political here, nor do I feel crazy political about this particular topic. But in a capitalist economy, when you hand a profit-making entity a position as the adversary in the middle between two endpoints, they're gonna fucking rent seek. I mean, that's literally what the system is designed to do.
Yes, and this is why we made such a big deal about net neutrality, and seeing now some of the effects of South Korea doing the opposite of that, and worse, We see, like South Korea, telecom operators in other markets are beginning to push for content providers to pay for network costs. Telecom operators in India, for example, which has the second largest wireless market in the world, recommended earlier this year that internet companies compensate them for using the network. Network operators in India cited specifically the regulatory changes in Korea as their inspiration. And it looks very much like it's possibly going to end up with them shooting themselves in the foot. In particular, I feel a bit like Twitch might have done better by just not enabling viewers on certain ISPs to be able to use Twitch and force those ISPs to stop trying to have these extra fees against Twitch. The problem is this is done more at a national level in South Korea, so their only option really is to turn it off for the whole country until the law changes because people are like, no, I still want to watch Twitch.
Well, so you're saying they should have just blocklisted a bunch of ranges then?
Or done rolling blackouts. Different ISPs once a week.
I was actually thinking along the lines of rolling blackouts while you were talking. I was like, well, just because it is all the ISPs doesn't mean you can't still do that. You just say, all right, this week, everybody on this South Korean mega ISP doesn't get access. And then the next week, you rotate it. You pick a different one. You wait until one of them stops doing it and you say, okay, these folks get access to Twitch all day, every day, never gets interrupted again. Then you see whether the other competitors, feel enough of a bite from people switching to that one so they can get access to their Twitch streams. And assuming that happens, well, that's when you start seeing the change that you were hoping for.
Marketer sparks panic with claims it uses smart devices to eavesdrop on people. So this is a company called CMG Local Solutions, and they claim they've got this active listening thing. And it seems to be bullshit, but it's kind of based on a sort of kernel of truth.
It essentially sounds like what all of your privacy-focused, extra paranoid friends have been yammering about for years now. All the mics in your house, everybody's listening. They're controlling you via what they know about you by what you said into your mic, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I talked about wheelbarrows the other day to my friend, and then suddenly I got a bunch of adverts for it on my laptop.
Now, here's the thing about that. Well, there's several things. One is that the source here, the company that is claiming they have this massive network of devices they're using capital A active, capital L listening on to, target these ads and et cetera. It definitely reads like overblown, overstated bullshit. They make some claims that Amazon, for instance, immediately fired back and said the things they're describing are impossible with Echo devices. But I think in general, this is one of those issues where, no, we can probably assume that this company can't do anything close to what it's saying that it can do. However, it's a pretty useful wake-up call to what these devices actually can and most likely are being used to do. There's still a lot of gray area here. We don't really entirely know everything that every vendor of a smart device, one of these assistants, whether it be a Hey G Word or Alexa or Siri or, whatever. We don't know all the things they're doing with that. We don't know all the times that data leaves your device and all the ways that it gets processed when it does. However, we can be fairly certain that at a bare minimum, they're picking up keywords. I don't think it would be at all unreasonable to assume that, for example, a manufacturer of, let's just say, FooBars, a very common gadget called a FooBar. Everybody needs a FooBar, right? It's not at all unreasonable to assume that a very large manufacturer of FooBars with a side interest in BAS, the most desirable characteristic of a good FooBar, is listening for those words one way or another. This is a topic that comes up in shopping and, et cetera, and et cetera. And somebody is very likely doing keyword mining to some degree on a lot of this audio data. But again, to what degree? You really don't know. The only way you can know is to not have any mics in your home or in your presence that might be sending information gleaned from audio recording off to the web. And at this point, that's almost impossible.
Yeah. Some makers of microphone-equipped devices have admitted to selling voice data to third parties, but that's usually voice data accumulated after a user has prompted the device to start listening to them and after they've maybe opted into having that kind of data collection.
Hey, Wiretap, what's a good recipe for pancakes?
Yeah, and usually you can have access to those recordings in your account settings or whatever. you can hear what it's been recording of you?
I wouldn't say usually. I would certainly say with certain well-known devices, like for example, with an Amazon Echo device, you can absolutely review a log of commands that you have given the device.
Yeah, and in your Google account, you can go in and listen to it as well.
But how confident are you that you have a grasp on how many different devices are out there responding to voice commands right now?
Not hugely, to be honest. I try and turn all that stuff off, but I don't know if I'm successful.
Yeah, there's a reason why my TV is not connected to the network at all.
Same.
Yeah, same.
But of course, in marketing company being a marketing company, CMG exaggerated and claims it knows when and what to tune into. So either it's listening to everything and then trying to fix stuff out after, or they're claiming it magically can just tell when it should start listening, which is a little kind of ridiculous.
You also have to wonder at the sheer insistence that so many vendors have for you using voice control for their devices, despite the fact that it's generally an expensive way even for the vendor to manage control inputs. It costs a significant amount of processing time, and a lot of that processing tends not to be done on the device. It tends to be done, in a cloud center that the vendor is having to pay for the compute and the bandwidth at that cloud center that does the parsing of the audio interactions. So you have to ask, well, once you know that this is expensive and it's a pain in the ass and it's something you continue having to deal with, why are they pushing it so hard? Why does my smart TV roughly once a week try to tell me, hey, you can search for things with your voice, just push this button on the remote and you can just say it? Like, why isn't it content for me to keep typing out my searches? I don't know the answer, but I am definitely saying you have to question it. People usually aren't doing things in companies without some kind of a plan to turn into some kind of money. And when you see somebody pushing something that's more expensive for them with no obvious benefit for them, you have to start wondering where the less than obvious benefit might be.
For sure with that. And you also have to think of the possible side effects. If all the voice processing happens in a data center off that the company has to pay for, how many years from now before that model of TV's voice command stops working? And especially we're starting to see the ones where the remote doesn't work anymore. Like the voice command is the only way to do stuff, and it might just stop working.
I might argue, Alan, that the voice command stuff just stopping working is one of the better outcomes, because what you're really talking about is what happens when that company goes under. And the best possibility is the voice command stuff that requires that cloud command and control stops working. The other possibility that strikes me as somewhat less rosy is some other entity gets control of that and sets it up to do what they would like it to do with all this abandoned hardware. And you might not even notice that something changed. You might just be like, yep, all my voice control stuff still works just fine. And, not realizing that, it might get parsed and the commands might come back down to your device and all that might appear to be working. But what else happened with that data? What else is going on there? And you don't know. You're using abandoned gear.
Yeah, and they could theoretically even push a firmware update to make the microphone be on all the time. Because, if they're just bought up this bankrupt company's thing just to be able to listen to everybody's TV, that's the kind of stuff they could get away with.
It's not just televisions. I've been feeling this real pressure to use voice for everything coming from a lot of directions. I have a pair of Google Nest smart speakers on my bedside table behind my head. When I sleep at night, I use them as a very small footprint stereo. I Bluetooth pair my tablet and I play music, go to sleep to. I don't actually want them to be assistants at all, so I've taken the hardware switch that mutes the mic and I've flipped it over to mute on both of them. And as a result, they are both lit up with extremely bright, absolutely angry toned 4 orange LEDs 24/7 365 that I had to put like camera blackout stickers over because they were so bright they made my bedroom look like I had a campfire going behind me at night. So there's one obvious answer. Oh, well, they just want you to make sure that, you know why your voice commands aren't working. Okay, I could see that to a degree, but why did there need to be 4 of those LEDs? And why did they need to be lit up this angry orange specifically that is never any other thing? And why did they need to be so bright they lit my entire bedroom to the point where I can't read text off of a paperback by the light of those LEDs, but that's mostly because I'm in my 50s. In my 20s, I could have.
Yeah, and as always, if you don't understand how the company's making money off this, it's probably because you're the product, not the consumer.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Collide. If you work in security or IT and your company has Okta, this message is for you. Have you noticed that for the past few years, the majority of data breaches and hacks you read about have something in common? It's employees. Hackers absolutely love exploiting vulnerable employee devices and credentials, but it doesn't have to be this way. Imagine a world where only secure devices can access your cloud apps. In this world, phished credentials are useless to hackers, and you can manage every OS, even Linux, from a single dashboard. Best of all, you can get employees to fix their own device security issues without creating more work for IT. The good news is, you don't have to imagine this world. You can just start using Collide. Collide is a device trust solution for companies with Okta, and it ensures that if a device isn't trusted and secure, it can't log into your cloud apps. So support the show and visit collide.com/25A to watch a demo and see how it works. That's KOLIDE.com/25A. Let's do some feedback then. Bruno writes, I'm writing to provide my take as a nature enthusiast and bioengineering student on the water use of data centers that you talked about in episode 167. Pumping water out of the ground or rivers in dry places is the obvious point, and you covered it quite thoroughly. But another issue arises with all the industries using water and pouring it back in rivers, and the ground to a lesser extent. Water temperature is a critical component of aquatic ecosystems, and virtually any use of water in industry will change its temperature. Studies have shown water temperature being impacted by up to several degrees many kilometers downstream of many industries. There is legislation in Europe about temperature difference water should not exceed, but I doubt it is the same anywhere else. Even then, the margins aren't tight enough. Some of the effects can be the disappearance of some fishes, to talk only about visible organisms, whose temperature tolerance range is narrow, sometimes only a handful of degrees, or the proliferation of some green algae that will greatly lower the biodiversity of the water by choking other plants out of light.
Yeah, those are definitely good points. The data centers that I was most familiar with that was using this was their own on-site well, and so they were cycling the water there and it would have less impact. But yes, you can definitely see this with rivers and lakes, and questions have been raised about this with power plants that output slightly warmer water, sometimes having the opposite effect, causing the fish to move to where the water is warmer, and then it becoming more of a hunting ground for certain prey. Outside of one of the nuclear power plants in Canada, where the water discharges, the ice never actually forms in the winter, and it's a most common sight for bald eagles in Canada to be there hunting for fish when they're much harder to find when most of the lake is frozen over. But there's this patch where the water is warmer and all the fish congregate, and the predators also tend to congregate and attack the fish.
I mean, essentially what this comes down to is we live in a closed loop ecosystem. And it is a small enough closed loop ecosystem that our own actions have real bearing on the conditions in that ecosystem. And therefore, we have to consider what inputs we're giving it, where, when, and how. Waste heat injected into one system can be a massive problem with, serious effects down the line. Waste heat input into another system can end up, being a benefit because maybe that system actually was a little too cold and it's good to redistribute the heat there. But ultimately, it's just you have to think like an engineer and actually consider these things rather than thinking like a hunter-gatherer who just is operating at a small enough scale. They go, oh, well, I'm not going to have that big an impact on my environment, and whatever impact I do have, I can move on and it will be erased by the time I come back. We're not hunter-gatherers anymore. We live in a small aquarium and we're a pretty big fish.
I think it's more a case of we need to get people from various disciplines together to actually assess what the impact of things like data centers are going to have. Because an engineer might not necessarily know. You might need a biologist as well as a physicist, as well as a bunch of people to get together.
That's an extremely valid point, and I could have more accurately said, think like an engineer who is thinking in discipline. Because that's the problem. You should be thinking like an engineer thinks about the things that an engineer actually cares about and really invests the time in both the education to learn about and, then the practice to get experience in. as opposed to the thing that an engineer knows nothing about, but Dunning-Krugers themselves into thinking, well, I know so much about my own field, I must be hell on wheels at this too. That's who you don't want to think like.
In our coverage, we maybe over-focused on dispelling the rumor that its water is just being used up and it's gone now. But it is a very valid point that even if they put it back, if they put it back too much warmer or colder or cleaner or dirtier or whatever, it does have an effect, and that can be a problem, whether it means that's not available for drinking or that it causes algae blooms or that it runs off the fish. Or even if it doesn't harm the fish, but it seems to help them, it's still making an impact that can have wide-ranging effects on now the place where the fish used to be. There's nothing eating all the bugs or whatever it could be.
It took me a second to correctly parse what you meant by the statement, the power plant runs off the fish. I was very confused for a few milliseconds there.
Sorry, but it scares them away.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed of either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Trace says, I've recently been exploring hardening my Linux container hosts with mandatory access controls. I was curious if you are all using a Mac framework in your environments, and if you have any thoughts on the trade-offs between the various modules, AppArmor, SE Linux, Landlock, Trusted BSD, etc. Any fun war stories?
So yeah, the Trusted BSD stuff has been integrated with FreeBSD for a long time, and I've used it in a number of different ways. It really lets you make up your own additional security policies. Some of the more common ones that are included by default in FreeBSD, there's one called Port ACL, which allows you to change the rules about which processes can open, say, port 80. So normally, only the root user can open ports less than 1024, and that required running your web server and your DNS server and all the other servers as the root user. And maybe they could spawn and drop privileges after, but they needed root to be able to listen on that port. With the Mac framework, you could say these specific ports can be used by this other user ID instead, allowing the web server to run without any root privileges, or the same for the DNS server. So we use that to run a custom DNS server called gDNSD on port 53, but without ever having to have any root privileges, since it's just going to answer DNS requests and doesn't need any root. There were also, I think in FreeBSD 13.0, they added a Mac module to allow NTPD to be able to change the clock on your system without needing any root privileges. After a couple of those NTPD amplification attacks, it was decided that that shouldn't have to run as root. So made a specific Mac policy says this one user ID has the magic ability to set the clock without needing more of that. And if you look at the documentation, you can even do what's called a file system firewall, where you can actually have basically firewall filtering rules about what certain processes can see or touch as part of the file system. The most interesting custom Mac module that I ever wrote was one we call File API, which was for, we had a REST API where users could upload video files to our thing, and we wanted those to be owned by the user who did the uploading, not by the user the web server runs as. And so with some ACL magic and this module, we allowed the web server to have permission to see its own files away from itself to the target user, but only if the file wasn't originally owned by root, and in a bunch of other restrictions that we could write our own of, and allows us to basically customize all of the security policy of the system to do exactly what we wanted to do. At Clara, we even extended this for an appliance vendor who had the condition that when the system crashes and we drop into the debugger, currently we have to have that disabled because somebody could type in the right things and make it dump out the VPN private keys, and then somebody would compromise the VPN by just having physical access to the router. So we use the Mac framework to actually control which debugger commands you can do. So it could print out the useful postmortem stuff to help an engineer, help a customer in the field solve why the thing crashed, but without having access to arbitrary memory addresses. So you can do a lot with the Mac framework.
I don't have anywhere near as much on this topic as Alan does. I'm reasonably familiar with AppArmor. I have worked with AppArmor profiles a fair amount over the years, but for me, it's always a question of figuring out exactly how to make something work, despite the fact that its AppArmor profile wasn't permitting it to work. There have been quite a few packages over the years in the Ubuntu repositories that come with AppArmor profiles that frankly are broken right out of the box. Sometimes they just won't let you do something that you want to do specifically on your system. Like, maybe you want to access your data over a mount. So it's technically a separate file system, and the application's AppArmor profile originally only allowed it to access its data on the same file system it launched from, or, something along those lines. But sometimes it just plain doesn't work at all because the AppArmor profile shipped just really wasn't tested. And in that case, my goal is always trying to figure out, how to do the least amount of loosening to that AppArmor profile to make it actually functional. Whether it's, for a specific use case that I have that wasn't thought about, or whether it's just a broken profile. It's easy to remove an AppArmor profile entirely. But that's the equivalent of, going through and doing a chmod -R777 on root to resolve your file permission problems. I am proud to say I was never one of those sysadmins back in that day, and I don't intend to be one of the kind in this day whose answer is just to yank AppArmor and similar platforms off completely because they got in the way. What I don't have as much expertise in actually crafting an AppArmor profile from the start, or in tightening them, because that is proper blue team InfoSec work. And I always describe myself as a very InfoSec aware senior sysadmin, which is correct. Doesn't mean I don't know anything about InfoSec, but it does mean that that's not really what I'm getting paid to do. And tightening AppArmor profiles down further, you really can't call that sysadmin work. That is very specifically InfoSec work that I'm just not usually on that end of those projects.
Yeah, like Jim, my only experience with AppArmor was tuning the profile for LXD to allow it access to ZFS when I did helped with the work to do ZFS delegation to LXD containers. And we just had to make sure the AppArmor profile LXD applied to the container still let the container access /dev/ZFS once we had made the changes in ZFS to make it safe to do so.
And now this is a part where I want to jump in and make a call that I don't think I've heard other people make before. If this is something that interests you, if you like blue team type work, if you like, tightening down the screws and make it harder for attackers to get in, and the idea of adjusting these kinds of profiles to, firewall off the kinds of access that aren't necessary for an application or reduce the attack surface, if all this sounds like really cool and, fun and energizing to you, we need you. By all means, please dive in on your favorite distribution and, install some packages and look at the AppArmor profiles that were provided and, make them better and submit some patches. Because that is very, very different than software design work, just the same way it's very different from system administration work. And it's not something that we're getting a whole lot in the way of quality contributions on right now. So please, whether your goal is to make sure to fix profiles that, weren't thought out well enough and they're too tight and valid use cases aren't getting through, or whether your goal is to take something that has no profile whatsoever or a far too liberal one and crank the screws down and make it more secure, we could use your help.
What about SE Linux then?
Well, it doesn't really much matter if we're talking about Trusted BSD or AppArmor or SE Linux. Those are three different frameworks that all accomplish the same goals with largely the same techniques. I don't think either Alan or I are as familiar with SE Linux as we are with AppArmor, much less, Alan and Trusted BSD. But again, it's the same considerations for the same reasons.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at jrs-s.net/social.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.